Hello, friends. Welcome back to my series, How the Gospels Became History, Jesus and Mediterranean Myths. This series is named after my book of the same title, published by Yale University Press in 2019. I'm going chapter by chapter, and we're more than halfway through, so thank you so much for sticking with me. This is the longest chapter of the book, and I hope you can follow along with me. So, we're going to be talking about miracles in chapter 10, and there's lots and lots of examples of these, and lots of examples in historical literature, which is interesting because miracles are those events which are considered implausible by many. They break the pattern, the ordinary course of nature, or what we think of as nature, and they surprise and have the power to amaze us. And in ancient historia or historiography, we have many instances of miracles occurring, and many of these are reported. So we know that in ancient historical writing, these don't fall outside the range of plausibility, and historians often add them for the sake of color and for the sake of entertainment and for the sake of believing, because sometimes it seems that the historians themselves believed or they wanted to believe in some way. All of you have heard of the Red Sea miracle. Moses splits the Red Sea with his magic rod. And this is a classic, but it's also very hard to believe. And when we're talking about an entire sea splitting before a man on command, that's just not very likely. And I suggest that it wasn't all too likely to the ancients either. But interestingly enough, there was a sea miracle that the Greeks knew, and this was one told by Callisthenes of Olynthus, and he was part of the entourage of Alexander the Great. Later had a falling out with Alexander, but that's another story. At any rate, he tells the story of how Alexander's army was marching through Pamphylia and had to cross over a watery area. An area, in fact, a channel of the sea that was normally filled. And for whatever reason, this sea channel did not in any way hinder Alexander's army. Alexander ordered his troops to march into the water, and the water that normally would have drowned them did not. And this was taken to be a miracle that the gods were inviting Alexander further east to make further victories. And interestingly enough, when Josephus has to record the Red Sea miracle of Moses in his Antiquities, he raises the issue of plausibility, knowing that his readers are probably not going to buy this. But in order to add plausibility to the Red Sea miracle, he mentions Alexander's miracle by the Pamphylian Sea in order to try, at least, to somehow get this miracle within the range of plausibility. An even more famous miracle is that of walking on water, and you can scour the entire Hebrew Bible or Old Testament if you prefer to try to look for water walking heroes, and you're not going to find them. Our only real parallels come from the Greek world, at least when we're talking about people who can walk on water. And one of these was Euphemus, son of Poseidon, and another son of Poseidon, Orion, were both said to walk or, in the case of Euphemus, run on water. The ability to walk on water is also ascribed to Abaris, whom you will remember is the sage who met Pythagoras back in the chapter on incarnation. And as if this weren't enough, we also have a story of Heracles or Hercules walking on the water off the coast of North Africa. Now, this is an interesting case. It doesn't appear in a historiography, but it might have originally come from a historiography. Seneca is the one who tells us about this one. And in this story, Heracles is shipwrecked off the coast of North Africa in an area, in a treacherous area known as the Syrtes. And he simply gets out and starts walking on the water. And although he's well away from shore, he walks over the water all the way to North Africa. So there are cases where heroes can walk on water, and Jesus, although certainly the most famous, is not unique in this case. What about stilling storms? Well, this is another favorite miracle of mine, and it really does seem like one of the more implausible. These nature miracles are big time miracles. But interestingly enough, they are not unprecedented in Greek literature. The twin gods, Castor and Pollux, or the Dioscuri, were well known storm stillers, and they often saved ships out on the open sea. In a historiography by Diodorus of Sicily, we hear of Orpheus who went with the Argonauts and encountered with them a storm. And Orpheus is able, not by praying, but by singing, to still the harsh winds and to save his crew. Interestingly enough, also Porphyry tells us that Pythagoras calmed storms and rivers for the safety of his friends. Porphyry wrote, 10,000 wondrous and divine deeds are uniformly narrated about this man, namely Pythagoras, and with common consent, his infallible predictions of earthquakes, speedy deterrence of plagues and violent winds, reduction of hail showers, and the pacifications of waves on rivers and seas for the easy passage of his companions. Unquote. Another interesting bit of trivia is that Empedocles also, who was reputedly a disciple of Pythagoras, Empedocles also could control aspects of the weather, including high winds. So the idea of calming storms or controlling harsh weather phenomena again is not outside the range of what could be reported in a historiography, and it's not outside the range for people who, for whatever reason, honored or venerated the characters who claimed, or for whom it was claimed, that they could control storms or high winds. Not a very well known miracle of Jesus occurs in Mark 8:23, where he is said to spit directly into the eyes of a blind man. And in this particular case, he needs to do the procedure twice in order for it to work. We also have the case of John 9:6, where Jesus is again able to heal a blind man, not by spitting directly into his eye, but by spitting and forming mud and then applying the mud to the man's eye. Now, this again seems like it would be a bit of a tall tale, both for ancient and modern readers. But interestingly enough, Tacitus and Suetonius tell us the story of Vespasian, who went to Alexandria and in the year 69 was proclaimed emperor. And there were many things that happened on that particular visit, but one interesting phenomenon was that two men approached Vespasian for healing, and Vespasian was told that if he put his heel on one of them, that person would be healed. And The other man, who was blind, for him, the prescription was that Vespasian would spit in his eye. Now, Vespasian was no fool, and he didn't want to look ridiculous, but after much cajoling, he was convinced to spit in this guy's eye. And after spitting in this blind man's eye, he apparently regained his sight. And this miracle was vouchsafed by many people many years after it happened, as Tacitus records, people who had no reason and no expectation of receiving any sort of reward from the emperor. After all, Vespasian was long dead, only after a 10-year rule. So there you go. A very interesting overlap with a healing by spittle. And perhaps the greatest of all miracles and the hardest to perform is the miracle of resurrection. Now, this particular miracle we're familiar with from the account of Lazarus in John 11, but we're also find such a miracle in Luke 7, the healing of the widow of Nain's son. I shouldn't say healing, I should say raising, because her son was dead and completely dead and being taken out for burial. Now, an interesting parallel occurs in the life of Apollonius of Tyana, whom I hope many of you have heard of. Apollonius was walking in the rain in the city of Rome out on the streets, and he noticed a funeral procession and a young girl being taken out on her casket. And it just so happened that she was very, very young, and her fiance was following. And Apollonius, for whatever reason, had the procession stop. He touched this girl's hand, leaned over, whispered something, and the girl got up. Now, this appears in the biography of Apollonius, written by Philostratus, and we really can't trace the tradition, but it looks a lot like the healing of the widow of Nain's son. And the idea of whispering into or whispering something over a little girl does also remind us of the healing of Jairus's daughter. If you recall, Jesus was called to heal this girl. In fact, she was proclaimed or announced dead before he could arrive and heal her. He goes into the room, whispers something over her, something in Aramaic, and she gets up and is ready to have a meal. So, interestingly enough, even a resurrection is not outside the bounds of plausibility for historiography. Of course, lots of people reading historiography, ancient historiography, are going to have various reactions. But what's significant is that these kinds of stories are in there, and these are the kinds of stories that the gospel writers spoke about Jesus. So, if you're interested in these sorts of stories, or perhaps miracles in general, check out the book chapter. It's chapter 10 in How the Gospels Became History. I only touch on a few miracles here. There are additional healings, casting out of demons or demones, and fishing miracles that I discuss in the chapter. And of course, you can check my references in the notes and look up these stories for yourselves. I want all of you to think for yourselves and to have enough knowledge to have good access to the ancient sources so that ultimately you're not dependent on scholars like me. You can find the sources yourselves and read them yourselves and evaluate them yourselves. So get the book, read the notes, and let me know what you think. Leave a comment and a like, and consider joining me on Patreon, where I can dialogue directly with you and answer questions. For now, I want to thank everybody for coming along. It's been great having you. I really appreciate you subscribing to the channel if you can, and making known what you want to see, what you're interested in through the comment section. I will get to everybody. Thank you so much for your patience and take care.